River Knight from Developing Australian Communities is a disability services advocate. River, is this something that you have come across much in your work?
Oh, hi. Yep, absolutely. This is a topic that keeps coming up again and again because the argument we have is two buckets of funding, and the argument about what bucket of funding is supposed to support and fund services that every person has a right to access should become redundant. Shouldn't matter whether it comes out of the My Aged Care bucket or the NDIS bucket. People have a right to those services, and having an arbitrary line in the sand at 65 is cruel, and it's something that we're seeing a lot of with ageing carers who are getting to the point where they're not able to continue. And we've got to get away from this stay at home until your partner burns out and then go into full-time care. There must be an in-between where we can keep people being at home and independent.
It seems like, why would there even be two separate buckets? I mean, if someone has a disability, they've got a disability. Does it really matter what age they are?
Well, it shouldn't in terms of the right to access services. So what we've seen is we had state-based programs. We've gone to a federal bucket of funding now for aged care. We've gone from state-based programs for disability to a federal bucket of funding. Both programs are very much aligned, and there seems to be this trend to try and perhaps amalgamate that at some stage, which makes a lot of sense. But what we see is that the issue at the moment is that it's the same staff, the same service providers, but it's two licensing programs. So the same service provider can do aged care as well as disability, have the same staff, but they have to get licensed under two systems and two different quality audits. It doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of saving money and doing things sensibly. And if you're lucky enough to get there before 65, NDIS will continue over, but a quarter of people over 60, between 60 and 65 are living with a disability in Australia. So that's a quarter of the population. Half of the population over 65 is also living with a disability. So it's not a small group within that population that we have here in Australia. It is more than half of people over 65, and that's a big issue because we've got that unmet need, and we shouldn't see half of Australians struggling to access disability services.
I suppose that is kind of the rub in a way too, because if you're talking about such a large volume of people, when the NDIS is already having issues with how much it's costing, then that is increasing the spend on the NDIS quite dramatically. If all of those people just get put into the same, well, you've got a disability, you all have the same right to support.
Well, the funding doesn't need to come out of the NDIS bucket alone. We can amalgamate that to aged care and NDIS funding. The discussion about the blowout and the costs of NDIS are very arbitrary because we have only just met our basic budget of around 20 billion. We haven't got to 30 billion. We haven't got to 40 billion. We've only just reached budget targets now. So while we're talking about projections, politically, it's a great way to get support for the work you're doing. But we do need to take that tongue in cheek because in the sector, we know that there's no big cost blowout right now for NDIS. What we're looking at is meeting what was planned. And for aged care, we can use that bucket of funds for aged care that are currently home care packages, and we can use that in the disability sector. What we need to do is cut down the red tape so disability services can support people with disability support needs rather than having to change over to an aged care system, which can be really tricky to navigate, just like NDIS.
If that happened, if the funding that is provided for aged care was switched over to the NDIS and everyone's just on the NDIS, would the extra funding, like how much of that would the extra funding from aged care cover? Because if they're spending less on people who are over 65 per person, then presumably that funding isn't going to cover the full needs of those people.
Well, we need to be able to provide the support that people have a right to access. So the way it's done at the moment costs a lot more because we have to separate those departments. We have to separate those support services. So allowing a service to do things under one umbrella makes it a lot cheaper and a lot easier. We see a greater amount of administration costs in the aged care sector. So the difference between the cost of me providing a support worker in the disability sector is cheaper than the cost of me providing a support worker in the aged care sector, because we find that the administration costs that come out of that funding are a lot higher in the aged care sector. And there may be all sorts of interesting reasons, good and bad, why that happens. But what we see in the aged care sector is we see people either they get a little bit of funding to stay at home, as long as they're fairly independent, but then when that doesn't work, they have the option of basically going into full-time care in an aged care home, which costs a lot more. And we don't want that option. We want people to stay at home as long as possible, because the caring that happens at home is usually by a loved one, family members, the family, the people around them. And when we burn that out, it costs us 10 times as much. So at the moment we're saying, can you give us a little bit of help so my husband or my wife can stay at home with me, and I'll provide most of that care, but I need a break so I don't burn out. When we sort of say, you know what, do it all yourself until you burn out, and then we'll put the person in full-time care, that's the most expensive option. So right now, we have the most expensive approach. If we were to amalgamate and do things sensibly, it'd be a lot cheaper. People would be feeling like they actually get to be valued in our community. And of course, you know, we can see that it'll go through a lot better for someone who turns 65 and doesn't have to completely change over bureaucracy, apply for new things, go through paperwork and struggle to get support.
So you're saying we could do this essentially without a significant increase in the overall spend between the two programs?
Well, right now we're providing those services. It's not as good as it needs to be in the aged care sector, because we find that aged care packages tend to be a lot smaller than NDIS packages. But again, some NDIS schemes need to be looked at in terms of, you know, well, are we funding things correctly? But aged care, we need to get rid of a lot of the administration costs that are happening in aged care and put that back into direct support staff costs. So I don't see a huge cost to amalgamate those services. And you can imagine running two federal departments, aged care and NDIS. There's two huge costs there. We're going to save a lot of money on administration just simply running two massive schemes. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But what I hear, you know, running the biggest disability connection expos around Australia, I get aging carers who have got adults with a disability living at home, and they're over 65, those carers, and they're getting to the point to say, you know what, it's not just me that needs some support. I have an adult living at home that I'm caring for who has a disability. I now have a disability. I either stay at home with a little bit of support to stay independent and those two people, that family stays together, or I have to put that adult into full-time care, which costs $400,000 to $500,000 a year. Then I need to go into full-time care because I'm burnt out. And so we're not just talking about the person who's in that situation who's getting over 65. It's often aging carers, people who are supporting an adult with disabilities that isn't getting a lot of funding because mum and dad are able to care for them. But when that stops, it costs 10 times as much.
All right, River Knight, thank you so much for your time this morning.